Okay, tonight's topic title is Yerkes Observatory, 125 Years of History and a Bright Future by Dr. Amanda Bauer. Yerkes Observatory is known globally as the birthplace of modern astrophysics and remains the home to the world's largest refracting telescope. It was founded in 1897 and run by the University of Chicago until 2020, when the Yerkes Future Foundation assumed long-term stewardship for the observatory and its landscape. YFF has raised a significant portion of its initial $30 million goal and has invested that in restoration, major construction work, and building the staff and programs. The Yerkes Future Foundation is committed to a future where Yerkes Observatory inspires creativity through exploration, art, and a connection with the cosmos. The YFF's mission is to ensure Yerkes continues to advance astronomy and to transform the observatory and its grounds into a destination for science and discovery. In this presentation, Dr. Bauer will let us know how they plan to do this and what opportunities exist for us. Dr. Amanda Bauer is the Montgomery Foundation Deputy Director and Head of Science and Education for Yerkes Observatory. Amanda received a PhD in astrophysics from the University of Texas at Austin, studying variations in how galaxies form, how they live their lives, and how they evolve into the diverse array of galaxy species we see today. She was previously the Deputy Director of Vera C. Rubin Observatory Operations and was named one of Australia's top 5 under 40 researchers and science communicators in 2016. Amanda aims to engage diverse communities with inclusive stories of technology and space, plus inspired moments of discovery in our everyday lives. Welcome, Dr. Amanda Bauer.
I'm going to use this microphone if that's okay. Yes, everyone? Okay. I talk with my hands though, so beware. Thank you for having me here tonight. I'm really happy to introduce Yerkes Observatory and all the work that we've been doing there. First of all, how many of you have heard of Yerkes Observatory? I thought so for this crowd. How many of you have been there? Even better. Okay, fabulous. How many of you have been there in the last 2 years? Ah, okay, a couple people, excellent. Well, I'm going to tell you, I only arrived there about 1.5 years ago, and so I'm going to kind of tell you a little bit about the legacy that I've inherited, what the Yerkes Future Foundation is, and what the science and art overlap cross-pollination adventure is that we have undertaken over the last couple years, and what it means for you and what you can get out of it. So this is a picture that is recent. The exterior of the building looks quite a bit like what it has for a while, although the plant life around has changed over time. This observatory was founded in 1897 by the prolific George Ellery Hale. He founded this as the largest telescope in the world at the time, and then he went on to found the next largest telescope, which was a reflector, and then the next one, and the next one. So 4 times over. And he was the director and founder of Yerkes when he was 24 years old. So this guy was really good at convincing people that what he wanted to do was a good idea and raising the money to get it done. So he convinced, as one of the founding astronomers for the University of Chicago that was just opened at that time, he convinced Harper, who was the director, or the president of the university, that we should have an astronomy institution. Observatories were the way to go. They were the future of science, and we needed to have one. So what they did was they convinced this guy named Yerkes, who was kind of one of the most hated men in Chicago, got his fortune through founding the L train, and just pushed people out of the way as much as he could. He had been indicted in the East Coast at that time, so not very liked. But Hale and Harper convinced him that if he funded this new observatory, then he could resurrect his name and he could rekindle his reputation. And so he said, okay, but it has to be within 100 miles of Chicago. So Hale already knew that observatories on mountaintops in California was very appealing, but the money was here, so that's why Yerkes was built within 100 miles of Chicago in Williams Bay, Wisconsin, this tiny little town right on Geneva Lake. The town that most people know is Lake Geneva. It's a little bit of a Geneva Lake, and the town is Lake Geneva. Okay, so many people have gone through here. Edwin Hubble did his PhD thesis at Yerkes Observatory. And for some reason, the 1909 cover of Scientific American on Christmas Day was the cross-section of the Great Refractor at Yerkes. Pretty much any image that was taken of an astronomical object in the first 10 years of the 1900s was taken from Yerkes. It was built to be a visual telescope, a visual observatory, and almost immediately they were like, okay, we gotta start taking some pictures. And they built some cameras. They had a well-known guy named Ritchie, who was an optical engineer, who sort of designed some of the modern telescopes and made it possible to really shift into reflecting telescopes. He was an early optical engineer at Yerkes, and so he did a lot of work. It still is the world's largest refracting telescope. When it was founded, it was the home base for the Astrophysical Journal, which is where I've published most of my research work. And there's a really interesting deep history of discovery and innovation that has happened at Yerkes. So here's some of the original or early images of the Great Refractor. You can see this wonderful instrument on the end of it with all these like kind of pirate wheel looking things to turn this maze of gears and chains to move and open up the shutter and do all kinds of things on the end. That was taken off at some point, so we don't have that anymore, unfortunately. It's an F-19 telescope with a 63-foot focal length. The place is just huge. The dome is 90 feet across. You can tell that it was just an achievement of the mechanical abilities at the time, and you just could not continue to scale up with refractors. So it really was important to move to reflectors, which they made possible with some of the laboratories there. A famous visitor that came by for about 4 hours in 1921 was Einstein. So he visited, this was his first trip to the US, and he said, I want to see two things. I want to see Niagara Falls, and I want to see Yerkes Observatory. So he popped by, and one of the funny little folklore things around Williams Bay is I've heard people say, oh, he was the best director we ever had. It's like, nah, he was just there for the afternoon. But they took a wonderful photo with the staff at the time. You can see there were a lot of women in this photo. There was actually just an exhibit at the University of Chicago that was called The Women of Yerkes, and it was featuring the women from its inception until about 1930. It was sort of synonymous with Harvard, with the human calculators that were there, Annie Jump Cannon and Henrietta Leavitt. There were a lot of women at Yerkes at the time, but the difference is that at Harvard, the women were only able to analyze the glass plates. They were not able to use the telescope, whereas at Yerkes, under the guidance of Edwin Frost, who was the second director, they led their entire own research projects using the telescopes that they had available to them. So it was a really strong group of women who went through there at that time. And Edwin Frost, sort of historically, has been seen as not a very strong leader, but what he did to guide and allow women to really lead their own research projects at Yerkes was pretty unique across the astronomical field at the time. So here he is. He actually was the director from about 1904 until 1932, and over that period he went blind. So Edwin Frost started to lose his sight in about 1915. He had glaucoma and cataracts, and then he had something else that happened, like a detached retina or something. So blindness for two different reasons in his eyes. So he went blind while he was the director there. Most of the photos, it's like he's kind of purposely looking off to the side. But you can see, while he was the director, there was this real congeniality. There was a familial community that was built around the observatory. A lot of the astronomers lived in houses on the property. We have like 70 acres of Olmsted-designed landscape. And so a lot of the families were there, and you can see an early skiing trip or skiing group that went around. And right outside of my office, there's this sign on the door. And so the door sort of opens into the hallway, and that sign on the door says, either leave completely open or completely shut. Because if you leave it halfway, he could walk right into it. So that sign's still there, and we still abide by that sign's indication. Another person who went through Yerkes was Nancy Grace Roman. Have any of you heard of Nancy Grace Roman? A couple of you. You will hear quite a bit. And let me tell you why. So she was at Yerkes as a graduate student, and she went on to become a faculty member there, sort of mid-century, 1950s. She did a lot of work with Morgan on discovering that our galaxy had spiral arms. That was one of the conclusions, one of the major research results that came out of Yerkes. She worked on that while she was a graduate student. Unfortunately, male-dominated field that it moved back to kind of after Frost's leadership in the 50s were not really supportive of her becoming a faculty member through the University of Chicago, who had their astronomy department out at Yerkes. So she tried to stick it out for a little while, but got treated so badly that she decided to leave, and she went on to become the very first chief of astronomy for NASA. And I've heard that the second chief of astronomy for NASA called himself the first male chief of astronomy for NASA. She was really critical in her work in convincing people that we needed a space telescope. And she got engineers and astronomers together to kind of hash out the engineering aspects and the science goals. And she was really critical to the development of the Hubble Space Telescope. Some people call her the mother of Hubble, but she didn't really actually like that name very much. So one thing that she is very well known for, in my opinion, is that she has a Lego minifig dedicated to her. We hold this in our library. And the other thing, you're going to hear her name a lot in the next couple years, because the next big telescope that NASA is going to launch is called the Nancy Grace Roman Space Telescope, based on her contribution to the astronomy program and founding of Hubble Space Telescope. So you're going to hear a lot about that. It's on schedule at the moment to be launched in 2026. We're currently working with the communications folks at NASA because they want to do a launch party at Yerkes for this event. Remember all the hoopla around the James Webb Space Telescope? That's going to happen again, and Yerkes is going to be at the center of it. So I, for one, am super excited about that. Well, we'll see. I haven't planned the details yet, but keep an eye out. Margaret Burbage is another woman who went through Yerkes. So she came as a postdoc in the 60s, and you can see her looking at her glass plates up here. I really wish we had one of those cabinets. I don't have one anymore. And she liked to look at spectra. So she was sort of inspired by a conference that she went to that was held at Yerkes to really dig into the origin of the chemical elements, what made stars, why did the galaxy spectra look the way they look with all these different lines in it. And what she uncovered with a couple collaborators, including Fred Hoyle, was that every single element that we know of in the periodic table from carbon on to uranium, about the time that we knew, were forged in the hearts of stars. She did this work while she was at Yerkes, and another alumnus of Yerkes, Carl Sagan, went on to sort of translate this finding into the statement, "We are made of star stuff." So the legacy of people who have gone through Yerkes is just kind of incredible over a number of decades, and it's just made me sort of inspired to be there and to continue this legacy of innovation and interesting thought. Here's one of the American Astronomical Society meetings in 1941. You can see the whole crew in front of the building. It's just beautifully over-designed, so the few of you in the room who haven't been there, I highly recommend it. I notice new things in the architecture every single day. If you haven't noticed before your visit, these columns right here, they are inside of it, they have each zodiac sign, so the animals that are represented by it, and then there's 3 different faces that are repeated a few times. One is Harper, who was the president of the University of Chicago at the founding, and he kind of looks like a little Buddha character. He's got big cheeks. There's one which is Yerkes himself. Now, you figure a lot of the people there would have known of him or about him or have met him. His face is from the front, but he has little devil horns. So his face is reproduced like hundreds of times around and inside the building, and every single one of them, he's got devil horns. He had a mustache, sometimes it's up, sometimes it's down. We found a one with a pirate patch over his eye. It's crazy how much fun they made of him. So building onto that, there's a third face in there, and that one is a profile of Rockefeller. And he has a really long nose. And when George Ellery Hale went out to visit the site for the handing over of the keys, he noticed that on top of that nose, there were a lot of little bees. Bees stinging his nose for money for the university. And Hale said, "You can't do that!" And so he hired somebody to go around and scrape off every single one of those bees off those long noses. And so you can still see that. You can see a little bit more texture over that long nose than anything else. So there's just these little gems all over this building. And honestly, I walk around all the time and kind of open a cabinet and find something and try to figure out what time period was this from, or who wrote that, or where did they reuse this over and over inside of the building. On the left, you've got some other famous characters who went through Yerkes. So Chandrasekhar, who won a Nobel Prize, was there for the majority of his career. I actually sit in the office right across from where he was. Hiltner was a director. I'm not too familiar with the work of Page. Gerard Kuiper was a director for a while, founder of Yerkes Observatory, and went on to discover the Kuiper Belt in the solar system. Then we've got Morgan, who discovered the spiral arms of the Milky Way, and then Van Beesbroek was sort of an institutional face. He was there, his wife worked there, his sister worked there. Both his wife and his sister were artists. And so we're getting a lot of donations of these beautiful acrylic, oil, and watercolor paints of the landscape and the building at the time that they were there. In fact, I just met somebody recently who came through Yerkes as a postdoc in the 60s and had commissioned Marguerite Van Beesbroek, which is his sister, to paint a watercolor of the landscape and the building from the perspective of where they were staying. And so he gifted that to me, and now it's hanging in my office, and it's just really fun, the stories that people are coming up with and sharing with us of their memories. So this is a more recent photo taken by one of our observing assistants. We have been holding some star parties and open houses. The next one is going to be actually this Saturday. We're doing a Mezzi marathon and an open house, so you're more than welcome to come to that. And these are some pictures of what the interior looks like these days. So these gorgeous marble floors, and down that hall there's this marble staircase that takes you up to the Great Refractor, because of course I need a marble staircase to go observe with my telescope. You can see the mosaic down here. There's a skylight up there that had been tarred over because the university just didn't know how to fix all the leaks, and so they just did another layer of tar. So we uncovered these beautiful skylights. We updated and refinished the floors and the siding. We took out a wall in this office to turn this into what we're calling the programs room. It's an original chalkboard in the back, but we can hold about 60 people in here for programs, for classrooms, for presentations. This is the historic library, which used to have this university blue carpet in it, so we took that out. Holds the historic collection, and in the top you can see lots of different instruments and focusers and spectrographs that we found around the building, and then another room that we use as an office space. So when in 2018, the University of Chicago said, we're done, we're not gonna fund Yerkes anymore, we're gonna close it. And they mentioned that in, I think, April of 2018, and October 1st, it was closed. And at that point, nobody knew what was gonna happen to it. They just locked the door. So people went into the building, they took things they felt were valuable, if people had access to it. I don't know what I don't know. I don't know what people took. The university itself took many things and put them into special collections or just held on to them. Other people who used to work at the observatory, who still live in the area, sort of went in and took some things, unfortunately. But the fortunate part was that a group of folks who live around Geneva Lake were so passionate about preserving this building and not having it turned into a spa or private residences or a mall, got together and formed the Yerkes Future Foundation and managed to win the bid for taking over ownership. So in the process of doing that, we've raised about $20 million so far of what is now our $40 million goal. So they took over in 2022, and immediately the place was shut down and turned into a construction site. When we took over, the roof was leaking like buckets of water into some of the old collections. So they tore off all those layers of tar that had been put in there since probably the 1990s, put in a new roof, solar panels. They had the old original electrical wiring, the stuff that's like live. So they ripped all that out, put in new electrical work, redid all the floors, redid this whole main floor, redid the bathroom, because if you're gonna restore a historic building, you don't really need to keep the bathroom. It was kind of gross. And then some restoration work to the actual astronomical equipment, but most of them, because nobody in the Yerkes Future Foundation at that time had astronomy background, they just sort of left that stuff alone. They did find sitting water in between the brick walls around the big dome of the telescope, and so they had to completely cover everything with plastic, get some masons in there, dry that out. The water dried at a rate of 1 inch per month. Yeah, so when I showed up, I did my interview in April of 2022, and it was a total construction site. But the thing that I saw was that the work they were doing was high quality work. They were of the mentality of, if we're gonna do it, we're gonna do it right, and it's gonna last for another 100 years. And I was really impressed with that. So I decided to join. This is a view from the roof. You can see the big dome and the solar panels that we have up there. So we're committed to this future where Yerkes inspires creativity through exploration, art, and a connection with the cosmos, so that imagination, collaboration, and scientific curiosity thrive and transform the world. This is not a museum that has a research group. This is not a research institution that does a little bit of outreach. We are really trying to combine art and culture and science together at the core of our mission. So I'm going to tell you a little bit more about how we're doing that and some of the things that we've done. But first I want to tell you a little bit about myself, like what brought me here and why am I interested in Yerkes. I am a kind of traditional research astronomer. I got my PhD at the University of Texas in Austin. And one of my passions forever has been to travel. So after I finished my PhD, or even during my PhD, I started to travel around the world to use telescopes, Gemini in Chile, I was in Hawaii for a little bit. I did a postdoc in England, I worked in Germany for a little while, and then I went to Australia for about 7 years. So this is a 4-meter telescope that I was one of the lead researchers with. It was about a 7-hour drive north of Sydney, which is where I lived. If you turn that telescope and you come all the way down, you see that little black tube on the end of it. That's the prime focus. And that's me sitting in the prime focus, working with an instrument that is a multi-fiber spectrograph. So that's called SAMI. And then this is around the catwalk of that telescope where you just see these amazing rainbows around the Warrumbungle Mountains all the time. We did a lot of public outreach events. This is a trip I did up to Hawaii. So I did a lot of observing, a lot of research. And then while in Australia, I really got into the public outreach and science communication. So I won the top 5 under 40, where I got to go and do a residency at the Radio National program, so their main radio and television studio in Sydney. It happened to be down the street from my house. So I got to spend a 2-week internship there, writing a lot of articles. I had the opportunity to co-host a podcast. So if you go and check out Cosmic Vertigo, there's 2 seasons of that podcast about all kinds of astronomy topics. I was in a video series called 60 Symbols of Physics and Astronomy, where we do like 2 to 3 minute videos where we're describing all kinds of things. And then I got to interview Neil deGrasse Tyson a couple times in Australia. So with an audience of 5,000, it was me and Neil on the stage. And while I don't agree with everything he says, he is an amazing person in front of an audience. He really knows how to get the crowd going. So I had a lot of fun with that. And I had purple hair, so that was kind of fun at that time. So after Australia, I moved back to the US, to Tucson, Arizona, which is where the headquarters of the Vera C. Rubin Observatory are. This is a telescope that is currently being built in Chile. It's supposed to be finished next year, then it'll go online. I moved over as the head of the Education and Public Outreach program, and it was really unusual for a federally funded telescope project, so this was funded by the Department of Energy and the National Science Foundation, to fund the development of an education and public outreach program at the same time that the telescope was being built. Usually it's just at the end and we're like, well, we'll throw 2% of your funding at it, do some outreach. And so this was fun because I had the opportunity to build a team, to create a vision, I had a budget, and I really got to develop that. So if you go to the rubinobservatory.org now, you can see some of the work. They just launched in the last year. And so this is the telescope. Now they've actually got all the shutters around the big dome. Most of the telescope is working. What the Rubin Observatory is doing when it goes online is, has anybody heard of the Rubin Observatory? A couple people, yeah. So once it starts observing, it will look at the entire sky that's visible to it over and over every few nights. It's got a huge field of view, moves very quickly, it's a really cool design. And then once you look at a part of the sky with a given filter for a few times, you build a template of what that part of the sky usually looks like. And then when you visit it again a couple days later, you subtract the template from the new image, and anything that's left is everything that's changed. So maybe it got brighter, it got fainter, it appeared, it disappeared, it moved. And so every time they've noticed something changing, their commitment to the world is to send out an alert within 1 minute of observation to the world that says something has changed. And here's a little nugget of information about it. And what they're predicting is that every single night, 10 million alerts will go out. Yeah, 10 million things changing in the night sky that we didn't know about before. So we couldn't do this project up until now because we didn't have the technology for it. We were designing this project for the computing capacity 10 years in the future. That's what we were predicting our costs on, because if I bought computer equipment 10 years ago, it wouldn't be capable of doing the calculations now for when the telescope's finished. So this is such a new, amazing way to see the universe. I did my PhD research on a sample of 250 galaxies, and at that time that was a huge sample. But I was only looking at one snapshot of each of those galaxies. So it's kind of like trying to figure out what human life looks like by having a family album. And you're like, well, some of them are these teeny tiny little pudgy things that apparently just lay down. And you see these snapshots and you try to figure out what like a human life looks like. That's kind of what we've been doing with the universe up until this point, and Ruben's really going to change that. And I tell you that whole story because Yerkes is going to fit into that story of how we uncover the universe. So here's Yerkes. Yes, there is light pollution. Yes, there is lots of issues, but we can still see the Milky Way from Yerkes. This is a photo that one of my colleagues took from there. And so I decided about a year and a half ago to move to small town Wisconsin to head up the Yerkes Observatory astronomy group. And I was the only astronomer in our group. So my first job was to see if the telescopes still worked. Literally, they were covered in plastic when I walked in. Nobody who worked there had any astronomy experience. So I took all the plastic down and I invited in all of the old directors and engineers who sort of still lived in the area, and they taught me how to use this. I'd used refractors before, but this thing is a skill unto itself. So here's my daughter. She just turned 8 last week, so here's when we first arrived. She is an expert user. There's a little finder scope, that little blue scope on the side, which is a good little refracting telescope all on its own. And we have renamed that the Idascope. That's my daughter's name, because she is so good. Like the communication she has in looking through that finder scope and telling you, no, go to the left, go to the right. Like she's figured out how that orientation works. It's amazing. Better than most professional astronomers I've worked with. So that's the Idascope now. And she's so spoiled that, especially in the summertime when the sun sets so late, we're going in and observing. She'll come up and she'll hang out with us for a while. But usually, you look at a star at the beginning to try to focus everything, and she's like, ugh, another boring star. So then she gets bored and goes down to my office and sleeps on my couch while we do the rest of the observing for the night. But the good news is that it totally works. It was really cranky after 5 years of inactivity, so it took about 3 of us to push it into place with our hands. Then we learned where you gotta grease and oil everything. As you might imagine, there is no documentation on how to use, how to maintain any of these. It's experience, it's knowledge. They had facility staff who would stay for decades. So it was really a steep learning curve trying to figure it out. And it's diagnosis by sound. If something is different, you're like, ooh, that's a new sound. Let's try to figure out where that came from and why. Which is a much more hands-on, tactile experience than, say, using this new, more modern telescope than any other on the surface of the Earth, Rubin Observatory, where you need entire teams of specialists to operate any given system in the telescope. So this is a whole new realm for me in astronomy, and I think it's a lot of fun, to be honest. So the Great Refractor is not one that we use for research. It is one that we use for fun, for inspiration. It's amazing. It's so fun to use. And we started doing some public observing, so we're ramping that up again next month, so you can see our public observing programs online. You can come and join us for an evening. One of the things that limits the number of people that can come on at any given time is this floor. This beautiful floor right here lifts to get you up to the telescope. And so somebody proved me wrong, but I think it's the biggest indoor elevator in the world. Happy to be proven wrong. But it's pretty spectacular. So it is still held by the cables of 4 sets of weights, and so there's a weight limit on it. So that limits the amount of people, that we can have on it at any given time. But there's also a 24-inch refracting telescope. So that was installed, it's a Bauer and Shivens that was installed in 1967. So it still works, and at the moment that's kind of our research workhorse. We were looking at Saturn, I think last fall. And so our mission at Yerkes is really to ensure that we are continuing to advance astronomy and transform the observatory and its grounds into a destination for science and discovery, an experience unlike any other where science, environment, culture, arts, and curiosity pollinate in novel and unique ways. So I want to give you a little bit of an example or a hint of what that means. Some of you may have heard, in December of this past year and the year before, we held this festival building the world's tallest glass tree. Did anybody hear about that? Yeah, a couple people. It was super fun. So we had this glass artist, Jason Mack, who came, and they built this kind of metal structure that spun. And he took donations of green and white glass from the community, and he built this kiln on site. It was a mobile kiln, and so he would melt the glass on site, and as this structure spun, you put the glass in on a stick, you melt it, and then you kind of let it get stuck onto or drip onto this structure, and then it spins around and it pulls these really long threads of green glass. So what's glowing here are these individual little threads of glass that have been spun as the tree spins. So we had in 2022, we had about 10,000 people visit. We have, on the weekends, it's open, the live tree building. This past year, we had about 15,000 people come in for the 9 days of building. We had something like, I think 800 people got to put glass on the tree. They had glass building, demos, and just the tie into astronomy. One thing I haven't mentioned yet is those glass plate images that was the founding of astrophysics. We have 180,000 glass plates at Yerkes that capture images of the cosmos over the last 125 years. The largest lens in the world for this refractor is actually 2 lenses. We've got the glass and the flint lens that are 40 inches in diameter. So that connection to glass and how we use it for astronomy, and 40 inches, it's not a little bit longer than that. Here. Thank you. So that connection to glass and art and being able to show live art being built right there. Their mission, Jason Mack's real message to folks is that glass is kind of infinitely recyclable. So at the end of this project, we have the glass tree there for a couple weeks so people can come and see it, but then they just break it down and keep that glass. They donate it to some of the glass schools around in the region, and they make little ornaments that we then sell at the next year's festival. So it's a really fun example of how we're kind of cross-pollinating art and science. Some of the other programs that we have going at Yerkes, we have a variety of guided public tours. So we're not just open for general admission. You can come onto the grounds and walk around. We have about 5 miles of trails, some fully accessible, wheelchair accessible, stroller accessible trails around the grounds, but you can buy a ticket to have a guided tour. There's a gift shop inside that you can get to, and they tell you a lot about the architecture, the history of the people who've been through there, the discoveries, what we're doing today, just a lot of fun stories that they tell. We have a summer speaker series. So last year we had Dr. John Mather, who's a Nobel Prize winner, come in. He worked with an artist who came to visit us named Ashley Zielinski. She was the artist in residence for NASA during the James Webb Space Telescope project. And so she created a couple sculptures for them. we invited her to Yerkes, and she came last year to create this marble sculpture that's outdoors that's called Time Will Tell, and it sort of tells a story visually of the warping of space-time due to gravitational influence of different kinds of objects that sit in space. So Ashley and John Mather knew each other working through the James Webb Space Telescope, and so they gave a presentation during our speaker series that just talked about kind of what it's like to be a research astronomer and an artist working together. So keep an eye out. I'll give you a couple dates for, no I won't. We have a speaker series coming. We have an astronaut coming this summer. We've got another astronomer from the James Webb Space Telescope. So lots of different visitors who are coming in. The Explore the Night Sky Tour, that's the one where you get to use either the 24-inch telescope or the Great Refractor. As you may know, the weather is not great in this region. So in the event that we cannot open the telescope, we do a little behind-the-scenes historical astronomy tour and show you some of the glass plates. We show you some of the instruments. You get some demos, you get some hands-on things. We take you into the dark rooms, into the bowels of the building. It's pretty fun. And then we have been hosting some workshops. We've got public star parties and open houses, the world's tallest glass tree. You can walk around the grounds. And then we also have some research programs. We have an astronomer in residence, artists in residence, and some summer research for undergraduates. So I'll tell you a little bit more about those. What is the astronomy that's happening at Yerkes these days? Really, it's based around things that change, light that changes. So transiting objects, variable objects, so transiting are things that pass in front of each other. The variable are things that change their brightness for some reason, internal to them. And then joining forces, so collaborating, innovating, using the glass plates, digitizing those, or working with some different groups, say the University of Wisconsin in Madison, to test out new instrumentation on the telescopes that we have. Sorry that I'm moving around so much, and you gotta move your telescope, move your camera. I'm a roamer. So some of the science projects we're doing, we've got the 24-inch reflecting telescope. We also have a 41-inch reflecting telescope. At the moment, it's not working. I looked into some of the history of this particular telescope, and pretty much from its inception in the 60s, it's been a problem child of the observatory. All of the literature is like, yeah, it's great, but it's so fussy. So again, it's not working right now, and I have too many things to focus on, so it's not my priority at the moment. But the 24-inch is great, it's working, and it can be remotely operated. I learned how to use it sitting on my couch when my daughter was asleep when I first moved to Wisconsin. But it's also almost back up on Skynet, so astronomers around the world can use this telescope. One of our main things is hands-on training for students. There's a lot of students who are, really interested in astronomy, undergraduate level, who don't have access to any kind of telescopes, professional level telescopes. And this is especially true after COVID. A lot of telescopes have been moving to, either they're so complicated that you have to have experts to be able to operate the telescope, or it's just easier for their funding model to not have astronomers go out and try to use it. And so they provide data to you, which is a really great thing, but if you're depending on the kinds of science you want to do, you really have to know what the raw data looks like. You have to know what a dark frame is, what a flat field is, and how to use it in order to diagnose any kind of issues with your data. And so there are not very many sort of mid-scale telescopes that potential astronomers or even graduate students have hands-on access to. So that's one of the things that we're working our program to be able to provide. We have 180,000 glass plates. So when you think about that Roman space telescope, and they're going to be looking at these things that change, that survey is going to go on for 10 years. So they have 10 years of data. What we provide on these glass plates is what those objects looked like 50 years ago or 100 years ago, which is information you can never get in any other form. And so one of the main things that we're doing with our students, our summer students, is building up the program to digitize each of those glass plates, including taking images of the beautiful script, the notes that they kept on the envelopes that those glass plates are held in. And then you're comparing those to modern day images so that you can identify exactly where all the objects are in the plate and the brightness relative to modern telescopes and modern surveys. And then the students get to be part of the discovery of new things. we could be sitting on these gems, on these glass plates that we don't know about because people didn't have the technology to look, to scan the whole thing at once and compare it to anything else. They were looking for one particular thing. So as an example, before the university shut down, there was a professor, Rich Crone, who had some students who were looking through the glass plates, and they were testing different methods to digitize the glass plate data. And they picked this galaxy kind of at random, observed in 1905. So most of the plate is this beautiful spiral galaxy. They compared, they identified where all the stars were, they compared it with a modern day survey, and they discovered that on this glass plate there was a supernova, a star that exploded in 1905 that isn't visible in images today. And so that kind of discovery potential, we can discover things that we don't know about, and the students who come through as undergrads get to be part of that process. So it's something I'm very excited about. This is the crew that we had last summer. We had these 4 students who came through, some from the region around here, some from the rest of the US. We had an astronomer in residence, Dr. Britt Lundgren, and we had a visitor, Dr. Amy Steele. And so we were able to have these students use the 24-inch telescope. They learned how to do that. Unfortunately, we had all that smoke from Canada last year, so we were not able to observe as much as we wanted. But we did get some observations, and then the students could compare those, just do the actual data reduction, come up with some pretty pictures, and compare those to observations that we found in the glass plate collection. So some of the projects they worked on were watching the changing light for the supernova that exploded last spring in the Pinwheel Galaxy. They mapped some activity around supermassive black holes. So those, as stars and gas interact with a supermassive black hole, it has some variability in its light. So we were just monitoring that over time. Examining some of the glass plates, you can see a couple in our collection right here. Here's the new supernova in M101. And then we had one student who looked at the glass plates to see how faint we could see, and he compared those to some of the objects that the Rubin Observatory will be able to see from the Southern Hemisphere to see what the possibility is for that pre-covery of Rubin objects were, so we could have that timeline of 100 years for these objects. He was able to get consistent enough results. The answer is yes, we can. That he presented a research paper at the American Astronomical Society meeting in New Orleans. So that was one of the first publications of the new existing Yerkes Observatory that I'm pretty proud of. Some other programs we're doing, open houses and public observing. So we are a nonprofit. We are not funded through any kind of grants, so we're raising money. So some of the tickets are not accessible to entire families. You know, they're not going to be able to pay for everybody to come. So one thing we do are these public observing and open houses where we open up the whole first floor to everybody. We usually invite 250, 300 people. If the weather's good, we have telescopes out on the lawn. We have presentations. We do little family activities. There's usually a scavenger hunt of some sort themed around throughout the building. And so those have been really fun, and it's just nice to have kind of an accessible option for people to come in and check things out. We've been hosting workshops for professional astronomers or professional business groups. This was a group who came last summer. I just put some of the quotes up there because one of the amazing things about this building is even from the moment you drive in to the driveway, you kind of like feel this sense of calm. It's sort of hidden behind the trees, and you just get a little hint of it. And you go in the building, and it just feels like you're part of something that has been there for a while. And when you hear these names like Hubble and Carl Sagan and Kuiper and Nancy Grace Roman, you just feel like you're there. You're ready to kind of open up your mind and explore outside of the little white boxes of university classrooms where we usually do our collaboration work. So we're starting to host these workshops. In fact, in June, the American Astronomical Society meeting will be held in Madison. So this is one of the biggest meetings of professional astronomers. So we're inviting some astronomers to come out and do an excursion at Yerkes for half a day. And right after that, we're hosting a Nancy Grace Roman workshop with about 50 astronomers who are tasked with deciding what the best observations are for the galactic plane. So of the Milky Way, kind of makes a line across the sky. And so there's lots of different kinds of science you can do with it. And NASA just announced they're going to fund particular research for that science. But there's probably 7 or 8 different groups who want their own particular things. So this workshop is a really hands-on workshop to try to decide, as a community, what are the best observations to make to recommend to NASA for the Nancy Grace Roman telescope to maximize the science that they can do for Milky Way. And it's really fitting that both Nancy Grace Roman was at Yerkes, but also she and Morgan, discovered the shape of the Milky Way at Yerkes. So it's a really fun opportunity for astronomers too. We've been opening up nighttime observing programs, either with the 24-inch telescope or the Great Refractor. This year we sort of decided if the weather's clear, we're just going to go with the Great Refractor. Because if you're in the 24-inch dome and you can see a little bit of a hint of the Great Refractor over there, you're like, oh, but I want to look through it. So we're just dedicating the program this year to the 40-inch. But it's a historic piece of equipment, so it is unpredictable. It crashes sometimes, not crashes, that's a bad word. Things go wrong and it doesn't function. Like the shutters that open the Great Refractor are these huge shutters that are operated by this tiny little motor and the cable system that pulls the whole thing across. And so at some point last year, when we were closing it, we heard a big clank. Diagnosis by sound, that was not a good sound. And so the shutters got stuck about 2 feet open, and one of the cables came off of a pulley. And so we had no way of powering that thing. And there's a hand crank that closes it, but it relies on the force of the cables. And so, unfortunately, there was a thunderstorm that was supposed to come in a few hours. And so it was a moment of all hands on deck, and we all came in. I was out at dinner, I had this nice dress on, just came in. It's all greasy now, but I still have it. We really tried as much as we could to get it closed, but realized we couldn't. So then we went to a store and got a bunch of plastic and covered everything, all the gears, below the floor, above the floor. It was quite an achievement. But the storm came, we managed to keep the water isolated, nothing else got ruined. It took us a few days to actually get it closed and to seal up and get all the cables tightened and everything. So we just we're trying to catch up with learning the system and what maintenance we need to do and what sounds are what, but it's a bit finicky. You just never really know until we get totally ahead of this and on the other side of some restoration, what's gonna happen. So, fingers crossed, everything's working pretty well. We had it open over the weekend, and it looked pretty good. Some specific upcoming events. We started a sci-fi film festival this spring, and so about once a month, we're showing different movies in that programs room that we restored, and we've been getting some various speakers from different universities around to come and present. In fact, the next one, I think we have a professor from the university, I don't know if it's Whitewater or Madison, who actually teaches a course on these films. And so he'll be there to guide through for a little while. And then we've got our open houses. There's one March 9th, and then there's one April 8th, which is a Monday around the solar eclipse. I see all of you are probably not going to be here, is my guess. So I won't say anything more. I won't either. I was telling my colleagues last year, hey, everybody, there's a total solar eclipse. I'm not going to be here, but you probably want to put a program together. I'm going to Ohio, where it happens to go over my sister's house, so I'm going to go visit my sister. All of these are ticketed events. One of the crazy things about this historic building is that it's got a lot of square footage, but in very awkward spaces. So there's not a space this big where we can put people. So you do have to get a ticket for any of these programs, but we would love to have you there. Here's sort of another summary of some of the programs we're doing. Visit our website. Come see what we've been doing, and with that, I will just say thank you very much for having me. I'm happy to take any questions if y'all have them. In the back.
Dr. Bauer, years ago, at the invitation of a graduate student, I got to look through the 41-inch. I don't believe you described what's going on with it these days. It's there, but what do you do with it?
It's not functioning. So yeah, we spent some time last year aligning optics and getting its instrumentation up. It does not have an eyepiece attached to it right now, but at the moment we're having some software issues for connecting the driver with the data collection mechanism, and it's just not on the top of my priority list right now. We'll get to it hopefully in the fall, but at the moment it's not working, unfortunately. Yep.
Yeah, I have two quick questions. You say you have all these plates. I know background in photography, the plates could be different sizes. Are they different sizes, or are they consistent enough so that it makes the life easier just to start on them to scan them, or do you have to adjust? Like this series is 4x5, this one is larger.
Of course they're not the same size. Most of the ones that were taken with the Great Refractor were 8 inches by 10 inches, sort of a standard size. And we've got a whole collection of the Palomar plates, which were 14 by 17, I think, and we've got these teeny tiny little ones that they collect spectra on, and then we've got 4 by 6, I mean, we've got like everything. And it's interesting because the collection is not only what was captured at Yerkes, but also at McDonald Observatory in Texas. So when McDonald was founded, they had the money for it coming from Texas, but they didn't have the astronomy expertise. So it was actually operated and directed by the director of Yerkes for a long time. And so many Yerkes Observatory astronomers would go down, collect their data, and then bring the glass plates back to Yerkes with them. So we've got a lot of McDonald plates. We also have what we call orphan plates. Some of them we don't know where they're from. Sometimes astronomers would come to Yerkes to start a working position and bring their collection of glass plates with them, so they are now in our collection. And interestingly, we don't have, I don't know what we have. I have a pretty good idea, but we don't have a whole catalog of everything that's in our collection. Partially because I just inherited what I inherited from the University of Chicago. The handwritten logbooks were taken by the university, so they have them now. So I'm kind of in negotiations with them. Can you please give me at least a scanned copy? And then once I have that, can I just have the logbooks? Like, why do you need them? So, I mean, it's not really a fully useful collection until I know what's in it. We have a couple volunteers who come in once a week, and they're working through doing that database. But to answer your question, what we've discovered is the best way to scan them is just a commercial scanner. And so you can put down a glass plate of any size, and you can do a really high resolution scan, and then they just have a different scale, you know, pixel to arcsecond, sort of like any telescope that you have. So we've kind of solved that problem. I know the Harvard Plate Collection built their own bespoke scanning machine starting in I think 2005 or something, and maybe spent $1 million trying to make that thing work specifically for the different sizes. And at this point, from what I understand, you need like 3 engineers to be able to operate it, and it doesn't really work reliably. So moving into modern commercial scanners is definitely the way to go, and that's what we plan to do.
To follow up on this quick, are they all glass, or do you have film also?
We also have film. The majority are glass, but sometime in the 70s they moved into film as they were sort of getting used to the CCD technology. So we do have a couple decades of worth of film. In fact, one of the cool things is one of the very first plates observed in, I think 1899 was, I think, of M13 or something. We have that glass plate, and one of the last pieces of film collected was of that same cluster, exactly 100 years apart.
Wow.
Yep.
Could you describe what the difference is to someone observing between the Great Refractor and your 2 reflector telescopes? What's it like when you do it?
Well, the reflectors are operated by computers, so that's easy. That's one experiential difference. The Great Refractor, we completely operate by hand. I use the setting circles and move it around. The only thing that's connected to technology is the sidereal drive. We used to have a clock drive, but at some point that got taken out, and I haven't been able to figure out when. So the refractor is just very much hands-on, everything about it. But then, you know, the fact that it's F19, they've all got pretty small field of views. Fortunately, they're all sort of 10 to 15 arc minutes. But that long focal length means that if you look at, say, a globular cluster, the distance between individual stars is pretty big. So you've got that distinction between individual stars. And so when you look at the center, at the very center, they start to kind of clump into one big brightness. But the fact that you can distinguish individual stars way down to the center of globular clusters is one of my favorite things to look at with the Great Refractor. And then, you know, I never tire of the moon and Saturn. The other two, the reflectors, so they're much faster, and they're connected to computers so we can move around. I haven't yet, like with the Great Refractor, it just takes longer to move that whole thing around and get to different objects. So we look at fewer objects throughout the course of an observing session. And you can see some of the chromatic aberration in it, so you can see the separation of some of the colors. It does a pretty good job of correcting for that, but you can still tell that that's happening. And I guess that's, you know, the 24-inch and the 41-inch both have these big metal tubes, which was like a fad in sort of the 60s and 70s telescope design. They're not great for seeing because you have to spend so much time cooling that metal down. And you can't like see the interior of the telescope. So that's a little bit different. But they're all, I mean, they're pretty quality for what it is that we can't see. It's fun to kind of go through Messier objects and things like that with them. Hope that helped. Yeah.
What's the major difference in the NGR telescope and the James Webb?
The NGR.
Nancy Grace Roman telescope?
Oh, the Nancy Grace Roman. So, I haven't actually used the acronym yet. I want to honor her name. So the Nancy Grace Roman telescope looks farther into the infrared, and it has a much bigger field of view. So it's kind of more equated to Hubble, but seeing more distant objects and just covering a lot more of the sky at once. The Hubble field of view is like tiny when you actually look at the footprint of Roman. Yep.
I have one more little trivial thing. Many years ago when I went on a tour there, a gentleman said, he pointed to the floor, he says, "Now you see that divot in the wood, little chunk?" He said, that was actually done, Carl Sagan forgot to adjust a telescope and banged into the part of the pier, or with that. Have you ever heard that?
I have, but I do believe that one's an old wives' tale. I don't think it was Sagan that did that. I do know of two other stories of people who actually did it themselves. So one of the engineers that I talked to said when he came on board, and this was probably in the early 80s, maybe late 70s, there's weights that are on the tubes. So when you change the instrument, you have to re-weight it. Because if you take an instrument off, you can imagine if it's 200 pounds, like the whole thing, 63 feet of metal tube just crashes down. And so when I first took all the plastic off of that wooden floor, right under where the eyepiece was of the telescope, there was this thing that looked like a keyhole, like a giant metal keyhole in the floor. Like, what's that all about? So I just kind of looked around and went on a little journey, and I found this big piece of really strong steel that had like it was like a stick, but it had a little piggy tail on the end. That's what I call it, very technical. And what you do with it is you wrap it around one of these pieces of metal on the telescope tube, and you anchor the bottom into that keyhole so that you hold the telescope down during an instrument change. When you take the instrument off, it like takes the weight. So I was also a little worried that maybe that thing would wiggle its way out, and then we'd lose it. But another discovery on the floor was way over in the corner, this like antique box that was painted black that had a rope with a hook on it and wheels. I opened it up, and it's a box of antique rocks. And so you just wheel that over and you hook it into the telescope as like a backup in case you lose your other backup. All very hands-on. And so what he told me is when he came, nobody told him that whole balance thing. He didn't think about it, and so he took an instrument off and the telescope just started to go up. There's like a ring around it that you can grab on with your hands, and he said he grabbed onto it and just started to get it lifted with it. And he got about 7 feet off the ground and was like, well, this is pointless. And so he fell down and the thing crashed into the floor. There's a big blue box on the lens end of it, and so what he said is that box took the majority of the impact, and so it crumbled, but it didn't affect the lens or the rest of the tube at all. So I think it's not Carl Sagan. Actually, Andrew Yan got wind of this story and reached out to us and said, absolutely, it was not Carl. So I respect her wishes, and we put a stop to that. So Bob Pernick, he was the engineer. A funny thing I learned is that in like the 70s and 80s, there were so many Bobs at Yerkes that I couldn't get it straight when I was trying to meet them and hear stories. I'm like, wait, which Bob was that? And they actually call them the Bobs. There was breakfast with the Bobs. There were 5 Bobs there at one time. Yep.
Did you say you looked at the moon with the 40-inch?
Yep.
Is there like some kind of moon filter?
We do, yeah. And you know, the field of view is pretty small depending on what eyepiece you use. So you just see like the very edge of it, but it's stunning. It's great. Yep.
So I'm curious about what kind of regular maintenance is done on the big scope. Obviously, I would imagine the gears and so forth, especially like optically, how do they keep it clean and so forth? And also, in terms of like the eyepiece collection, I'm presuming you're using modern eyepieces now. Do you have a set of classic eyepieces from when it was first built and things like that?
We have quite a few different optics. The one that was on the telescope when I found it was a plate camera with a little lens on it that was from about 1972. And so there's like a thing you can slip out, and you slip the glass plate or the film into it. And then what I found on a table was a focuser that was from a company called Astrophysics, and it's like a 4.5-inch around focuser that they don't make anymore, but that was put on it. So we put that back on, and there's a set of, what's it called, Scientific Explorer, something like that? Yep, you know better than I do. We sort of inherited a set of lenses. Somebody, one of the facility workers, just funny stories when I tell them back, like brought to my office a box, and he was like, I think this is probably for you, and it was a set of like 8 eyepieces of different sizes. And I'm like, yeah, that probably works. So, you know, every now and then we go around and we find something and we're like, oh, this is about 2 inches. Oh, this is a 3-inch one. Let's see if it fits. Or we found a set of filters. So, you know, we've got a couple different types of filters that we put in there.
I was wondering if there were any like Clark that,
We don't have any of those that I found. We do have like the original focuser and things that were on the original 24-inch that Ritchie designed that Hubble did his dissertation work with. So we've got some of those around, but most of them aren't functional anymore. They're kind of rusted shut. There's scratches all over the eyepiece. Like they were kept, but they weren't really preserved. So we do have some of those around. Honestly, we've got a lot of those things around, and somebody who's more of a historian probably knows where they are or what they are. At the moment, I've just sort of got things taken care of in a place while I'm trying to get these things actually working again. We have 2 astronomers on staff now, and so there's 2 of us. So I think my goal right now is to just get the research going, get these working, get them accessible, and just contributing, and then I'm gonna go back, or I'm gonna get a curator or something like that who can help me like dive into the history of all those things. But I had, last October, we hosted the the Alliance of Historic Observatories, which is like Lick Observatory, Mount Wilson, Pic du Midi, like lots of different places around the world. And so we hosted that group at Yerkes, and it was so fun to just take them around. And they were like, oh, look at that thing, oh, I know what that is. So I learned quite a bit. Remember, my background is like modern astronomy and modern equipment, so a lot of this is new. It's a pretty steep learning curve, but it's been a lot of fun. One of the things that I look forward to is eventually we'll have some kind of display there. You can imagine like technology of every era came through. So I have a row like punch cards. I have like how they use the punch cards. They wrote down how you like could put these in, all the computers, all of the like equivalent of microfiche. We have a George Foreman grill. We have all the original calculators. Like we have so many random pieces of technology around there that are just really fun to look at, and trying to like activate them or just tell their story is definitely something that's going to be fun.
Hi, my hobby's been astronomy now for over 50 years, and I've also been active in judging science fairs. And I was wondering if you would consider maybe possibly having maybe a night on the telescope as a prize for some of the science fair winners in the Chicago area.
Oh, that'd be fun. Reach out, see what we can do. Yeah.
Unrelated, but you mentioned McDonald Observatory. One year, the Texas Star Party people arranged for some behind-the-scenes tours of the McDonald Observatory telescope. And they told, one of the astronomers there told us about one time an astronomer kind of went nuts and decided to destroy the telescope and emptied a .38 caliber revolver into the main mirror. And so what they did, it didn't shatter the mirror, is they drilled the holes out, bullet holes, and painted them black. It kept going. And they said it had very little effect on the telescope. And they showed us the bullet holes.
Yeah,
It's
that,
Texas.
this is the 107-inch at McDonald Observatory. It's another one that was finished in '67, so it's got a big metal tube on it. I did a lot of my doctoral work there. I was the youngest student in our research program, so I got to go collect all the data with that telescope. So many times I turned that telescope over to the side and walked down the tube to look at those things. And I think the optical analysis was that it only blocked 1% of the light from painting the inside of those.
Not an astronomer, though, as I recall, it was a staff member.
Yeah, it was a pretty recent addition to the staff team. He went and shot it, and then also took he got really frustrated, so he took like a rubber mallet and started hitting the glass as well to try to break it, because it didn't do it didn't shatter like he was hoping it would. So he ended up getting frustrated enough that he left, but the facilities crew went and did whatever you do to a car to make it not start. So he went and got in his car and it wouldn't start, and that's when they got him. That's how the thing you do to the car to make it not start. That's the thing.
Texas.
Well, y'all might be tired of hearing my voice now. Thank you.